Scripture reading today will be from Nehemiah 2, verse 17. Nehemiah speaking. Then I said to them, come. Sorry, forgot. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and then we will not be in disgrace. Come preach the word, Darrin.
Well, I don't remember it being said yesterday, so I'm going to just say it. Happy New Year. And Friday, Happy Quitter's Day. Did y'all know that? The second Friday in January is now known as Quitter's Day. That's how pathetic we are. That we have a day now that says this is about as long as people can handle their New Year's resolution, less than 2 weeks. And I can appreciate that. I haven't always had the best success with a New Year's resolution, but wow, 2 weeks is it? It's all about how you start, though, isn't it? I think if you go into a New Year's resolution and you say, well, I kind of want to lose some weight, or I kind of want to stop this or start this, and you're half-hearted about it. Or you go into it and you say, well, let's see how this works. You're pretty much welcoming Quitter's Day at an earlier rate when you go into it with that mindset. You got to start strong when you're seeking to do something, to have a plan. You've got to start strong. And as Paul mentioned, we're starting a mini-series on Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is a man who started strong. And that's the purpose of what I'm going to share with you this morning, is to look at how Nehemiah started strong so that we will start strong in this new year. Well, when we look at someone like Nehemiah or any character out of the Old Testament, we're talking about a broad span of history in the Old Testament. So when is Nehemiah written? Who is the audience? What's going on when it's written? So let's do a little background on Nehemiah before we jump into the text and the first couple of chapters that I'm going to look at today. So Nehemiah takes place around 444 BC, which means it's about 450 some years before Jesus is born. So near the end of the history recorded in the Old Testament. Of course, there's 400 years of silence before Jesus is born. So this is right before that period of silence. So Nehemiah really is recording some of the final history of the Old Testament, even though its place in your Old Testament is not at the end of it. It's much more to the center. But it's recording some of the final histories of the Israelite nation before that 400 years of silence. So what's taking place when Nehemiah is written? This is after the Babylonian exile. So the Israelites were put into captivity in Babylon, and they were there for 70 years until Persia takes over, and King Cyrus declares, you can go back home. You can go back to Jerusalem, because all the people from Jerusalem had been dispersed to other nations. And Cyrus comes on board and he says, no, you can go back home. And only a remnant go back home. Jerusalem is in ruins. The temple has been destroyed. The walls have been torn down. The gates have been burned. And this remnant, this takes place about 100 years before Nehemiah. This remnant does return, about 50,000 people, just a small fraction, and they are fired up. They're going to rebuild the temple. They're going to rebuild the walls. They're going to put Jerusalem back in business. And they get home, and they are able to rebuild the temple, but not to its former glory. And Jerusalem is anything but business as usual. The walls are down, the gates are down. This is a vulnerable city. In that day and age, if you didn't have walls, you didn't have gates, you were vulnerable to everything. And so 100 years have passed when we come on the scene with Nehemiah. and Jerusalem just has a temple and nothing else. So we open the book of Nehemiah, but not in Jerusalem. 800 miles away, the book of Nehemiah opens. And Nehemiah is introduced right away as being in the city of Susa, the capital city of Persia, where the king would spend his winters, the king of Persia, Artaxerxes at this time. Artaxerxes. And that's how this book opens. We're introduced to Nehemiah, and he hears that his brother, Hanani, has come back from Judah, has just come back from Jerusalem, 800 miles away. Can you appreciate that in that day and age, how much time it takes to travel 800 miles? A 3 to 4 months journey or more. Well, his brother has returned. And Nehemiah meets his brother and some others that have returned, and he has 2 questions for them. This is in the first few verses of chapter 1. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. So first of all, he says, I want to know about the people. How are they doing? And secondly, how's the city? His heart wants to know. Just because he's in Susa doesn't mean he doesn't care about God, doesn't mean he doesn't care about God's people, doesn't mean he doesn't care about God's holy city. He does. These are the first 2 questions he has for his brother. How are the people doing, and how's the city? And his brother tells him, things are not good. In fact, he says, the survivors, that's how he refers to them, the survivors are in great trouble and shame. Great trouble and shame. Well, they're back at Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the temple. What is this deal about trouble and shame? It's because they're vulnerable. They're a city without protection. Their anxiety level is high because they are vulnerable to attack, to theft, what have you. They're vulnerable. And Nehemiah, 800 miles away from where that's taking place, has a reaction to this news. And it is an extreme reaction. It says that he sat down and wept and mourned and fasted and prayed for days after hearing this news. That's an extreme reaction to this. And he continues to fast and pray for days. And in fact, most of chapter 1, the majority of it, tells us what he prayed day after day. It starts with this prayer of glorifying God, of glorifying the strength of God, the might of God, the power of God. And then in the center, Nehemiah confesses his own sins and the sins of the people, essentially saying, the situation we're in, we deserve to be in this. We betrayed you. We sinned against you. And we got exactly what you promised we would get. But then he ends the prayer on a positive. In verse 11, he says, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. He says, all of that is true. You are worthy of praise. We're in the situation we're in because we deserve it. But Lord, use me to make things right in Jerusalem. And be with me as I go talk to this man. And we'll talk about who that is in just a moment. But what's interesting at the end of chapter 1 is it ends with this phrase, and I was cupbearer to the king. It's almost like it's out of place. Why would that just be planted right there? And I was cupbearer to the king. It's almost as if Nehemiah says, I don't want this to be the focus of who I am, but watch how God uses the position I'm in for his own glory. Watch how he uses this job that I have and glorifies God through that job. And that's exactly what he's going to do in chapter 2. Because as we enter into chapter 2, Nehemiah is back at work as the cupbearer to the king. What's a cupbearer? We don't have them today. It's not something you're going to find in the want ads. A cupbearer was somebody that was trustworthy to the king. You want the most trustworthy person being your cupbearer, because he is going to test the wine that is given to you to make sure it's not poisoned. You don't want your enemy testing the wine, because they'll maybe do a pretend sip and say, yeah, it's fine. You want someone you can count on. But dude, look at what can happen to you in this job. You could die. But this is the position that Nehemiah has. He's the cupbearer. He tests the wine. He's in a position of influence. He's really someone the king relies on. And so he's back at work after hearing the news of how Jerusalem sits. And he walks in sad, something you don't do with a king of Persia. But Nehemiah says, I'm not going to put on a false front. I am devastated by this news. And he walks into the king's presence sad. Could be a death sentence, could be fired, all kinds of things could happen. But instead, the king says, why are you sad? I've never seen you like this. You're obviously not sick, so what is happening? And Nehemiah doesn't miss a beat. He tells him immediately, how can I be happy? How can I put on a false front when my city lies in ruins? The king says, well, what's your request? And Nehemiah jumps on it. Here's my request. I need time off to go back and rebuild the walls. I just told you, this is a 3 to 4 month journey there, and then a 3 to 4 month journey back. So he is bold in his request, saying basically I need at least a year off to go do this. But wait, there's more. He doesn't end with just asking for time off. He says, and by the way, you've got some influence. Can I have some papers that will grant me access and safe passage all the way down? And while we're at it, you have this whole forest, the king's forest. Can I have some lumber out of that to rebuild these gates? Bold request. But what's interesting is when the king asks him, what is your request? There's just this little statement in there that before he answers him, it says, and Nehemiah prayed. And look at the request, how it was responded to. But then the king basically says, but wait, there's more. I'm going to send my own army and officers with you and horsemen. The king says, I'll give you everything you asked and more. Isn't that how God provides? And so Nehemiah takes off with all this entourage with him. And he goes to Jerusalem. He doesn't tell the people there why he's there. But he goes and he inspects the city. And he sees how bad it is. And he makes a plan. And once he has made a plan, he comes back and gathers everyone together. And as was read in verse 17 of chapter 2, he gets them all together and he says, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. He rallies them. He gets them behind the plan. And tomorrow and the next day, you're going to hear about how that plan goes into action and the obstacles that come up and the success in the end. But today, we're just looking at these first 2 chapters. And in what we've just looked at is a great example of how to start strong. There's some lessons that we can pull out of these 2 chapters on how to start strong. The first lesson that we learn from Nehemiah is your first instinct needs to be prayer. Your first instinct, pray. Nehemiah's high view of God gave him the confidence to start with prayer. Not to finally get to that, but to start with prayer. There's a famous quote that you may have heard around here from one of our former instructors, Abe Lincoln, who said, "If we think we can do the Lord's work without prayer, we are tricking ourselves into believing we can do the Lord's work without the Lord." And Nehemiah doesn't trick himself. He starts by going to the one who can do all things. He starts there. Look in chapter 1 and verse 4. As soon as he hears about the state of Jerusalem, as soon as I heard these words, the first thing he does, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. His first instinct is not to say, what are we going to do here? How can I fix this? His first instinct is to go to God. He starts strong by going to God. In chapter 2 and verse 4, when he's in front of King Artaxerxes, the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king," and he goes on with his request. But how many of us, if we were in that situation, sitting in front of a great authority, and he says, "What are you requesting?" You say, "Hold on a moment, I need to pray." I don't know that he did it out loud. I don't know if he did it in his head. I don't know if he did it under his breath. But he took a moment and took a breath and prayed before he did anything else regarding what the king was asking. His first instinct is to pray. And as I thought about that with Nehemiah, it came to me. There's someone else whose first instinct is to pray in all things. Jesus. Luke records that when Jesus is baptized, it says he was praying. When he chooses the apostles, he starts with prayer. When he is going to heal someone, he starts with prayer. The night before his crucifixion, the greatest work this world has ever seen done, he starts with prayer. There's something to be said there, that if we want to start strong, we start with prayer. The second lesson I learned from Nehemiah is that he started strong by having a heart tied to God's will, tied to it. Not just that he knew about God's will, his heart was tied to God's will. You see, when you read that first chapter, and when he hears about how Jerusalem lies in ruins, and you hear his extreme response to that, where does that come from? Where does that come from? Here he is in a comfortable job, in a comfortable palace, and when he heard that news, he could have said, "Well, that's a shame," and shook his head and said, "But I've got to go back to work." That's not what we see him do. His heart is so tied to the will of God that when he sees the will of God is not going forward, it grieves him. It shakes him to the core. And he wants to see something done about it. Because he had the choice to stay comfortable. But because his heart is so tied to God's will that when he sees the need, he says, "I've got to do something about it." His emotional response is not fake, and it doesn't end with just an emotional response. It ends by moving him into action. And I think about Jesus. I think about Jesus in Luke 19 as he looks over the same city, Jerusalem, and he weeps over it because he sees that city is rejecting God's will. And it just doesn't emotionally affect Jesus, does it? The lostness of this world moved Jesus beyond emotion. It moved him to action. Philippians 2. A section of verses that you're so familiar with. Philippians 2, 7 and 8 says he emptied himself. That's the effect this had on Jesus. Beyond emotional, beyond weeping, he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. A heart tied to God's will has more than just an emotional response. There's a response to action. And that's the third lesson we learn from Nehemiah, is that yes, he started with prayer. Yes, he was grieved when he saw that the will of God was not going forward. But third, he moved forward in bold faith. He made a plan and he went. He made a plan and got up and went. Action. He could have stayed in the comfort of the palace, just as Jesus could have stayed in the comfort of heaven. But instead, he acted. And he goes. He goes. He didn't just pray and then do nothing. He prayed and then said, how are you going to use me in this? And he goes to Jerusalem to rebuild. He starts by analyzing what's wrong with the city, and then he rallies everyone around him. Now, some are going to oppose him, and you're going to hear about that tomorrow. There is going to be opposition, always going to be opposition to God's will. But look what he does with the people that aren't opposed to him. He tells them the plan. He tells them how God is with him and how the king has sent resources. They give glory to God for that. But in verse 18, this is the rallying cry from the people. Let us rise up and build. They caught hold of the strong start that Nehemiah had. They want to join in this strong start. They want in. They caught the vision. What a start to what appears to be an overwhelming project. But what does it mean to you and I today? What is the application of Nehemiah to us today? I mean, the temptation is to say, I don't have a grand project like Nehemiah. I don't have walls that need to be rebuilt like Nehemiah. Greek word for that, baloney. Our project is actually not our project, as Brother Fleming shared yesterday. It's God's project. And it's much greater, much grander than walls around a city. It is God's redemptive plan to transform me and to transform you and to transform this world, to redeem mankind, to put mankind back in the relationship that God wants us to be in. That's our project. It's God's project. So how are we going to start strong like Nehemiah with God's project? Well, the first thing is we've got to make our first instinct prayer. As I look internally, which is uncomfortable, at things in my life that don't belong there, am I praying about those? Am I saying, I don't want that as part of my life? Am I praying for God to transform me in those areas? Am I being specific? As I look out at the lostness of the world, am I praying over the lostness of the world, or am I just shaking my head saying that's a shame? Or does it break my heart? The way it broke Nehemiah's heart, the way it broke Jesus's, still breaks Jesus's heart. So is prayer my first instinct? Secondly, is my heart tied to God's will? Am I comfortable with things remaining in my life that don't belong there? Or does it grieve me that that has no place in my life now that I'm a son and child of God? As I look around the world, does it grieve me that there are people that are lost the way it grieved Nehemiah and Jesus? But finally, am I going to act? Am I going to just pray and do nothing? Or am I going to pray and then say, Lord, lead me. Lead me to a life that is transformed. Lead me to someone who needs to hear the gospel. Am I bold enough to pray for action and to pray about plans that I've made? Am I bold enough to make plans? I hope you are. I hope we are. Forget about Quitter's Day. Let's start strong this new year. Let's follow the example of Nehemiah and start strong, and let us rise up and build.